Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for joining me on the channel today. I'm Ted Yacucci, and today we're going to do part three of our J.D. Tippit Murder Conspiracy presentations, and we're going to be looking at Reserve Officer Kenneth Croy's being in the Dallas City Jail basement, standing next to who? Jack Ruby for the minutes right before Ruby pushed forward and murdered Lee Oswald as he was being brought down into the basement. So we know from our first two presentations that here's this reserve officer, someone without any real police authority, who happens to be the first person on site at the J.D. Tippit murder, although we won't see his car anywhere when he says he pulled up because we examined that he was already there, and we went through that in the first two presentations. And then we find that it was the same reserve officer, Kenneth Croy, who finds this wallet that's supposed to belong to Lee Oswald at the Tippit murder scene that has Alex J. Hidell uh, um, identification inside it, along with Lee Oswald. But somehow this wallet's going to mysteriously disappear just hours later. And now, thirdly, we find that this same reserve officer, Kenneth Croy, is standing next to Jack Ruby for the minutes leading up to the Oswald death in the basement of the Dallas City Jail. Well, this guy is either, is the most incredibly lucky or unlucky guy, however you look at it, or he had reason to be there, and I think that's much more the case. So we're going to go ahead and jump right in. And first of all, let's look again at the pictures that show just the proximity of Croy and Jack Ruby in the basement, and they were standing actually shoulder to shoulder. But you'll see in the Warren Commission testimony, Croy will try to fudge this, right? One quick thing, I do want to apologize. In the last presentation, for some reason, I was spelling Croy Kroy rather than Croy. Just one of those brain cramp things. If anybody else noticed it and it bothered them as much as it bothered me, I apologize. All right, let's get right into it. Let's look at those photos, first of all, of Croy and Ruby standing next to each other in the Dallas City Jail. Okay, so here we can see that clearly several minutes before Lee Oswald is brought down in the elevators to the basement of the Dallas City Jail, Reserve Officer Kenneth Croy is clearly seen, as is Jack Ruby, standing to Croy's left. They're standing so close together that they have to be touching shoulders. And just a few minutes later, we see now that Jack Ruby has moved to the left side of Kenneth Croy. You can actually see Croy's hat if you look carefully right to the left of Jack Ruby's hat there. You can see Croy's officer's bill up there, of the bill of his hat. And you see that Jack Ruby is preparing for the best route to get by those reporters just to the front of him, to attack to attack Lee Oswald. And again, he's standing shoulder to shoulder with who? With Reserve Officer Kenneth Croy. And of course, not only are they standing right next to each other twice, Ruby's both on his right and then on his left as he prepares for the best route to get to Lee Oswald, right? But the fact that they're standing together right where Jack Ruby has decided that that's going to be the easiest and best and most efficient place to get to Lee Oswald, right? I mean, they could both be in the basement, but they happen to be right next to each other, shoulder to shoulder, and they're in the exact place where it's the most efficient route to get to Oswald. That's not coincidence, guys. That's premeditated murder. That's Kenneth Croy helping Jack Ruby to be set up. And you know that Kenneth Croy would make sure, because he's got his police uniform on, you know he had to make sure that it's in the perfect position, right? You've got a few people right in front of Jack Ruby. So if Oswald's coming down, and Oswald knows Ruby, right? So he might not recognize him right away. It's a good, perfect hiding place for Ruby. He needs to just push past one person and he's in position to shoot. This is not coincidence. This is premeditated murder. Let's go ahead and look now at some of the testimony of Kenneth Croy before the Warren Commission, what they asked and didn't ask, of course, and we can see just how shady this guy is. Okay, the first thing that we see, the Warren Commission asks Reserve Officer Croy, what's your occupation? And he says, I have several. And Griffin says, let's have them in order. And he says, I'm in the real estate business. I have a mobile service station. I'm in the steel erection business. And I'm a professional cowboy. All right, now, what does this tell us about Reserve Officer Croy? First of all, if he had all those things going for him, well, then how does he have time to be a reserve Dallas police officer, right? And also, we know at this time that he is estranged from his wife, but he's not living somewhere else. He's living with his parents, okay? So we can't make any definitive conclusions about that, but it seems like either Reserve Officer Croy is not really bent on telling the full truth, or at least he seems like at least we have to question what he's going to say as we move forward. All right, now we move down just a little bit, and Griffin asks, did you report to the jail or the police department on Sunday, November 24th? And he says, yes, I did. He doesn't say yes, one or the other. He just says, yes, I did. About what time did you come in? Do you recall? No, I don't. Again, how can there's only a few things that you did on that day. How can he not recall these very specific questions of what time he came in? Then Griffin says, well, your letter of November 26 indicate you came in at 8:35, and Croy says that's probable. And then Griffin says, now, sometime after you came in, were you assigned to guard a particular area of the basement? Is that correct? Croy says, no. Well, Griffin says, well, would you tell us what you were assigned to do? And Croy says, well, when I came into the city hall, I went to the assembly room, and that's where any initial assignments are made, in the assembly room, making up the muster and the roster of the reserve officers that arrived. All right, so what can we take out of this? Now, there's a very important question that's not asked next by the Warren Commission, by Griffin. And that question is, all right, who gave you the assignment then to go to the basement of the Dallas City Jail? Who told you to go there? Who was the guy giving out the muster? Who was the Dallas police officer? They ask those kind of very specific questions everywhere else, but they're doing everything they can to leave this nebulous trail when Croy testifies. That's another reason why his testimony is so short. They know they can't go into specifics with Croy in a lot of areas. Okay, the very next bit of testimony here, Griffin asks, how long did you remain there? And Croy says, well, I was in there. I was in and out of there between there and the basement. So in other words, the assembly room and the basement. Well, and Croy says, I was never relieved from that duty. I went in there, but I was never relieved from it. All right, well, this is really important, because if he is assigned to be in the basement of the Dallas City Jail from the assembly room, from that muster, even though he doesn't say who was giving out the muster, the assignments, well, then why was he going from the police, from the basement back to the assembly room, back to the basement, back to the assembly room? If he was assigned to be in the basement, why didn't he stay in the basement? Why is this so important? Because he can't be narrowed down. What was he really doing? he was probably letting Jack Ruby into the basement, right? So that's why he says here, I was back and forth, I was back and forth. He doesn't want to be tied down, and the Warren Commission doesn't want him to be tied down. And that's why they let him get away with saying, I was back and forth between the assembly room and the basement. Now, if you're assigned in an important event like this to be in the basement as a guard, then certainly that's where you would have to be. You wouldn't be able to just leave and go back to the assembly room and then saunter back to your post whenever you feel like it, right? Okay, now we move into some of the really questionable stuff that Kenneth Croy will say about when he first encountered Jack Ruby in the basement of the Dallas City Jail. And he changes his story so much. But here we go. Griffin says, well, maybe I don't understand your affidavit. You stated someone in authority gave instructions to move the press back against the rail. At that time, I turned and told two men standing to my left to move back against the rail. One of these men had a motion picture camera. The other was in a dark maroon coat with a black thread woven into it. He was wearing a black hat. My father had a coat something similar to this man I spoke to. I then turned my attention back to reporters which were standing in front of me. I believe this man to be Jack Ruby. All right, now this is interesting because this is the beginning of Kenneth Croy saying, I moved Jack Ruby back. I moved him back. He was always behind me. Well, he wasn't behind him. He wasn't behind him. What we know from the photos is that he made sure Jack Ruby was exactly to the side of him. And you had the brick wall there, right? Which was even protecting Ruby more from being jostled out of the way or being seen before it was time for him to commit the murder, right? So what Croy is saying here is just to add chaos to his statement, and he changes it all the time. I was trying to get Jack Ruby to move back. He wasn't trying to get Jack Ruby to move back. He was trying to position Jack Ruby in order to give him the best and most protected route to Lee Oswald. And here we go. We're going to move forward. It says, were you behind that group of people? I was behind them. How far were you behind them? Oh, a couple of feet or 3 feet. He's talking about the few reporters at the very, very front there. And Griffin says, back where you were standing, were people as closely bunched up as other people were? Croy says, there wasn't anyone to my left other than the two people I told to move back. To my right, there were several other officers standing there with me. Well, this is clearly a lie. Let's go back to the photograph, and we can see in the minutes leading up to Jack Ruby bursting forth to shoot Lee Oswald, Croy is clearly lying here. He was standing directly next to Jack Ruby, both to his right and then to his left, I'm sorry, and then to his right as Jack Ruby burst forth to shoot Lee Oswald. All right, and if we move ahead just a little bit, we can see that Griffin says, can you describe the people that you saw Ruby push through? And Croy says, well, it was just a group of reporters there trying to get closer to Ruby, I mean to Oswald. And Griffin says, were there any police officers near Ruby at the time that he moved through that line? And Croy says there were no uniformed police officers there. If there were some detectives there, I don't know because I didn't know any of them. Well, the one uniformed officer that we know was near Jack Ruby, of course, from the photos, was Reserve Officer Kenneth Croy. Now, this next part is really important, and it's really interesting because Croy is asked, well, how long were you there that day? And he says, I was there till 8 o'clock. And he's asked, did you tell anyone about this man supposedly rushing by you, Jack Ruby, to go shoot Lee Oswald, so that you could give details about it? And he says, no, I didn't tell anybody, just another reserve officer. Can you believe that? So, this is a guy that we are supposed to believe is so interested in police work and he wants to be involved in everything and he's everywhere. Events are happening around that weekend. But for 6 hours or more, he doesn't bother to tell anyone when he's interviewed himself that he saw Jack Ruby and felt Jack Ruby push by him. Of course, he doesn't want to say that because then that will lead to more questions, and he doesn't want anybody to know where Jack Ruby really was, which was alongside of him. Let's look at that. Okay, and here it is. Griffin says, "How long did you remain there?" Croy says, "A good while." Griffin says, "Then what time did you go off duty?" And Croy says, "It was about 8 o'clock that night." Griffin asks him, "During that period, did you tell anybody, that you had seen a man brush by you who you thought was Ruby?" And Croy says, "Yes." And Griffin says, "Who did you tell at that time?" Croy says, "Lieutenant McCoy." And Griffin says, "Reserve Lieutenant McCoy?" And Croy says, "Yes." And Griffin says, "Anyone else?" And Croy says, "I don't recall if I mentioned it to Reserve Lieutenant Nickerson. I may have." Well, that's absolutely ridiculous. Everybody that was in the Dallas basement that close to the action was interviewed during those 6 or so hours after the murder of Lee Oswald took place. And that includes Kenneth Croy. But he never bothered to tell any real officers or any real FBI agents that he saw and felt Jack Ruby brush by him and rush forward to shoot Lee Oswald. Absolutely, patently a lie. And that's what we know about Kenneth Croy. He not only was he a liar, and not only did he, every time he was asked about something specific during his testimony, he would say, "I don't know, I don't know, I don't remember." And again, this is par for the course with all of the conspirators. And this was only a couple of months past what was probably one of the most intense events that happened in their life. But their excuse is always, "I don't remember. I don't recall. Did you ask someone this? I don't remember if I asked him. I don't remember what he said." Absolutely ridiculous. All right, let's take a look at Reserve Officer Kenneth Croy and the events that he says surrounded him on the weekend of the assassination of President John Kennedy. First, he says he was caught in traffic for at least 20 minutes after President Kennedy was murdered. Now, we don't think that's feasible from studying the traffic patterns at the time, and we think that that gave him time to accompany Captain W.R. Westbrook in his search for Oswald on the Marcellus Street bus. Next, Croy says that he saw his estranged wife drive by, invite her to lunch, and then proceed to the Oak Cliff section to change his clothes at his parents' home where he was living. What I think is that this was an excuse by Kenneth Croy and the Warren Commission to give Croy a reason to even be in the Oak Cliff section before Officer Tippit was murdered. He states that he heard the call concerning Tippett's shooting and was first on scene, but yet his personal car is nowhere to be seen at the Tippit murder or surrounding streets. Next, Officer Croy says he finds a wallet on the scene of Tippett's murder that he will turn over to Captain Westbrook, which contains Alex J. Hidell identification. But that wallet will disappear completely later that night after being brought back to robbery and homicide by Captain Westbrook. And that's even though there is photographic evidence of the wallet being examined by many of the officers on the Tippit murder scene. And finally, Croy will be photographed standing directly next to Jack Ruby in the minutes leading up to the Lee Oswald killing in the basement of the Dallas City Jail. Okay, I think that we've been able to prove beyond pretty much a shadow of a doubt that the actions by Reserve Officer Kenneth H. Croy and the statements that he made about his own actions on that weekend of the JFK assassination are highly questionable at best. Now, I think what we need to do now is push forward in our next video and examine, well, who was giving Kenneth Croy his orders, who was giving him his marching orders. And that could only be one person, in my opinion, Captain W.R. Westbrook. And I believe Captain Westbrook was really a prime player in all of the operations surrounding the actual murder and cover up of President Kennedy. And of course, he was later outed as a CIA operative. So that's what we're going to do in our next video in this Officer Tippit Murder Conspiracy. That will be part 4. Thank you so much for being with me. I really appreciate you being on the channel, and I look forward to seeing you next time.